to our Lunch and Learn virtual with Touchstone Therapy. Today we have Hilary Davis here from Touchstone Therapy, who will be discussing how to set healthy boundaries with kids. So welcome, Hilary. Thank you for being here. Again, this will be recorded, so we will post it and send it out in our D73 digest. My name is Megan Goldman. I am the Social Emotional Behavioral Coordinator here at Hawthorne, and I want to thank everyone for coming today. And with that being said, I'm going to pass it over to Hilary. Hilary, you're going to need to unmute yourself. I apologize. I thought I could unmute you, but it will not let me.
There we go. Okay.
Welcome, Hilary. Thank you for being here today.
No problem. Thank you. Let me go back. Okay, perfect. Well, hello, I'm Hilary Davis. I am the owner of Touchstone Therapy Center in Vernon Hills. We are a multidisciplinary clinic where we provide behavioral health, speech, OT, physical therapy. And for behavioral health, we see everyone from kids to adults. We do kids, adolescents, adults, couples, family therapy. We do social skills groups. We do parent support groups. We do workshops. Right now, I'm going to give you guys a heads up before we even get started. I'm not sure if you can hear what's going on behind me, but we're actually moving our clinic in on Monday. And so they're taking apart our gym right now to be able to move to our new location. So if it's hard to hear me, because I'm hearing a lot of machinery happening in the background, just please let us know in the chat and I'll see what we can do about that. But I did want to let you know because I can hear it. Or if you see me jump because I've heard some very large metal like that's being knocked around, that's where that's coming from. So, keeping that in mind, today's talk is about setting healthy boundaries with kids. And it's about empowering everyone as parents to learn how to set healthy boundaries that will help their kids into young adulthood. So if you have any questions, there's going to be a portion where we're going to have a Q&A after the presentation part. Please feel free to put any questions that you might have in the chat, and Megan's going to be monitoring that for us, and then we'll kind of address them when we get to the Q&A portion. But with that, we will go ahead and get started. So what are boundaries? Boundaries are guidelines, rules, or limits that a person creates to identify what is reasonable, safe, and permissible ways for others to behave around them. And when we're thinking about boundaries, we want to go, well, why do they matter? Inevitably, for kids to feel safe and secure, and this is not for every child, but for a lot of children, when they know what the expectations are and what happens if those expectations aren't met, that helps them to feel more safe and secure. When they don't know what the boundaries are, what ends up happening is the world feels very chaotic. I don't know what's going to happen next. Maybe I'm going to put my opinions out there on what I think should happen next. And a lot of times that can lead to different issues in relationships, power struggles, acting out some negative behavior. It also helps teach respect for others. What we do in our homes affects what our kids do when they go out in the community. So if we have healthy boundaries at home, they will learn to respect boundaries out in the community and with their peers as well. And it also encourages independence and self-control. So when kids are younger, and you're going to see as we go in with the presentation, we're going to kind of say, okay, here's what applies to younger kids, and here's what applies to older kids and adolescents. But as kids age, healthy boundaries help them to know where the line is and what is personal responsibility. And again, what do we do in schools and the community when we are respecting boundaries? So let's talk a little bit about the benefits of healthy boundaries. And some of these I've kind of covered a little bit already, but we'll go through them again. So for parents, having healthy boundaries can reduce stress and frustration. And for the purpose of today's presentation, you're probably going to hear me use an example a lot regarding screen time, because it's something that just about everyone deals with in their homes, whether you're dealing with preschoolers to adolescents. Screen time is an issue. So we're going to use that as an example. A lot of times you can get into power struggles with your kids. And when we have healthy boundaries and expectations, it actually reduces the stress and frustration because it puts the ownership onto the child or adolescent. So, for example, if you have a boundary and you're like, we only get X amount of screen time per day. And if we find out that you went and secretively grabbed a device and were on screen time, maybe the consequence is going to be that you lose screen time for the next day. Maybe it's going to be more specific, like you lose the amount of screen time that you were on over for the next day. But what it allows you to do is not get into a power struggle and just say, gosh, I wish you could have that screen time. But you know what the consequence is. And by choosing to go over your screen time, you're choosing that consequence. And it allows you to kind of really be more empathetic towards your child instead of them going, you're just a mean parent and you're trying to take this away from me. It also helps to clarify expectations and roles in the home. What is expected of everybody? I don't know if anyone's ever heard this before, but sometimes when you give a kid a consequence and they didn't know what the boundary was to begin with, they're like, well, that's not fair. If I had known this, I wouldn't have done this. And that's a conversation for another time. But when we have those expectations and those boundaries in place, we can say, well, hey, you know what the boundary is, you knew what the expectation was, so this shouldn't be a surprise that this is what's going to happen next. For kids, the benefits of healthy boundaries have to do with increased emotional regulation, better communication skills, and a strong sense of responsibility. When we're using an example, let's say again of screen time, whether you're young, whether you're an adolescent, what you're basically saying is, hey, I'm giving you ownership to know, what the appropriate way to handle screen time is. And that is your responsibility because you know what the expectations are. And in doing that, what you're really laying is the foundation for what they're going to be like as young adults. In addition, the communication that you have around setting boundaries when you do that as kids is going to be reflected when they go to high school, when they become young adults. They're going to be better about setting healthy boundaries with others as well. And in the community, having healthy boundaries increases respect in community spaces like school. It reduces peer pressure. And again, it increases responsibility. So when we're following boundaries and rules at home, we are more likely to do it in community spaces like school, at a camp, out at the library, and it will help them to appreciate the boundaries that others set as well. So if you were to do a search on boundaries on the internet, you would come up with a lot of different categories for what types of boundaries there are. But for the purpose of today, what we're going to be talking about are boundaries that are applicable to children and adolescents. And those are physical boundaries, emotional boundaries, time boundaries, and behavior boundaries. And we're going to dive into these a little bit more in depth. So when we're talking about physical boundaries, these are boundaries that involve personal space, touch, and respect for one's body. Why do physical boundaries matter? They teach children body autonomy and consent. They help children to understand personal space and respect for others, and it prevents physical aggression and inappropriate touch. So, when I'm working with clients, I like to use this example of why these things are important, even when you're little. They set the foundation for the conversations that you're going to have about consent, about more things that might not be age appropriate for a preschooler or a young elementary student, but may come into play when you get to middle school or adolescence. And the example that I kind of like to use with this is something that happened with my own child. So when my child was 7 years old, we went to Great America, as people do, with a group of friends and their parents. And there was a ride that my child did not want to go on. And one of their friends was like, oh, come on, you want to go. And she was like, no. And he was like, don't worry, it's going to be fun. Once you get there, you're really going to enjoy it. And she was like, no. And he's like, it's not going to last that long. I've been on this ride before. It's really quick. And, you're going to be okay. And again, she said no. And this actually kind of went on for like another minute or two before the adults started hearing what was going on. And fortunately, the parent of this other child stepped in and was like, hey, when someone says no, they mean no, and we have to respect that. And I know that you really want to go on this ride with your friend and have fun, but if she's saying no right now, we have to respect the fact that she's saying no. And the reason why I love that example so much is because we don't typically think about consent with younger children, but even at 7 years old, having physical boundaries, talking about those with kids, sets the stage for consent. And it may be about, in this case, a ride, but you can kind of hear how these like topics could be used in middle school or adolescence, or hopefully not a negative situation where it's an adult and a child, and helping them to understand those physical boundaries, and that when it comes to your body, no means no, and what an enthusiastic yes is, will help kids to understand, what is feeling safe for them. So working with those physical boundaries is good, because then if a parent is not there, like in the example that I gave you, a parent was there, they're able to kind of know where the boundaries are for themselves. So, examples that we might use for young kids would be your body belongs to you. So no one should touch you in a way that makes you feel uncomfortable. We knock before entering someone's room, and hands are for helping, not for hitting. With older kids and teens, we're going to change it up a little bit because they have more information about the world. We might say you have the right to say no to hugs or physical contact. Or if someone makes you feel uncomfortable, you can tell an adult, and to respect other people's personal space in public and at home. And again, I want to give another example with this too. When we're talking about physical boundaries, you also want to go over with your kids, what does that look like? Because a lot of times they're told things like you have a right to say no to physical contact that you don't feel comfortable with. But sometimes kids, especially younger kids, they might get into a tickle game, or maybe they think it's funny to kind of depants someone at school at recess, and helping them to understand that even though those things might not necessarily fall into conversations that we've had about inappropriate touch, those things, if they make someone feel uncomfortable, are still important. And what do you do when those situations happen? So, those are physical boundaries. And a lot of people talk about physical boundaries with their kids, but then that takes us to emotional boundaries, which is a little bit more ambiguous. And emotional boundaries involve recognizing and respecting feelings, both your child's and others' feelings. So, why do emotional boundaries matter? They help kids to develop emotional intelligence and their emotional vocabulary. It teaches them that all feelings are valid, but all behaviors are not necessarily valid. And it helps to reduce emotional overwhelm and codependency on parents. So, when we talk about increasing emotional vocabulary and emotional intelligence, what we're doing is we're helping kids to realize that there's more than just sad, mad, and happy, and that if they're able to set boundaries around feelings that they might have either at home or with friends, that they are more likely to get the responses that they are hoping for, and also there might be better problem solving. So an example that we might use is, it's okay to be angry. 100% we want people to feel good about, okay, you can express the feelings that you have, but it's not okay if you're angry to hit someone. Or, when we're looking at examples for young kids, it's okay to feel mad, but we don't yell at people. And that helps kids to understand that all feelings are valid, but there are expectations both at home and in the community in terms of what's okay and what's not okay. You might help your kids to have resources like, if you need a break, you can use your calm down spot, or you don't have to play with someone if you don't feel comfortable. And what does that look like? This comes into play a lot when we get to middle school and high school, because when we're talking about older kids and teens, emotional boundaries get kind of murky. So, examples that we might have are, you don't have to share everything with your friends, and they don't have to either. It's okay to say, I need it space when you're upset, and you're not responsible for making everyone happy, which is a big one that comes up with middle school and also teenagers. A lot of kids feel responsible for whether or not their friends are feeling bad or need something. And when we're working with them on emotional boundaries and helping them increase their emotional vocabulary, basically what we're saying is you can be empathetic towards your friends, but also you're not responsible for fixing things for their friends. And what can you do when those things happen? So, next, we have time boundaries, which are a little bit more black and white. And those are boundaries that involve structuring how time is spent to create balance, responsibility, and self discipline. Time boundaries matter because they help with executive functioning skills, and in particular, time management skills. It helps to reduce power struggles around routines. If we kind of go through, okay, here's the expectation at such and such time, we start getting ready for bed. Here's what's going to happen. Here's when bedtime is. It also teaches the value of priorities. So, looking at responsibilities before play. Examples might be, for younger kids, screen time is 30 minutes after school or whatever your screen time limits are. And then you get to play outside. So, what we're teaching when we're setting time boundaries are, work first, then play. Or we have to clean toys up before we start a new activity. Bedtime is at 8 p.m. every night. And so that helps kids to feel comfortable and know what's coming next. We'll talk a little bit later about what is helpful for younger kids. You might need more visual aids to help them with time boundaries because their working memory isn't the same as an older child or teen. So having pictures to kind of let them know, okay, here's what's next can be helpful. For older kids and teens, it might be something like homework must be done before video games, or we all have family dinner at 6 p.m., phones stay in another room. Or if you miss curfew, you lose privileges the next day. So they're very specific, they're time oriented, and they help kids to kind of know, okay, I understand what the expectation is and what will happen if these time boundaries aren't kept. And our last are behavioral boundaries, and those define what is acceptable and unacceptable behavior, helping kids to understand rules, expectations, and consequences. Behavioral boundaries matter because they help kids with self discipline and accountability. They teach respect for rules, authority, and social norms. They help to reduce power struggles and tantrums by setting clear expectations. And they help kids to understand the connection between actions and consequences. Now, when we're talking behavioral boundaries, you always have to kind of think of when kids age up, when you start to give them a little bit more autonomy and responsibility. So for young kids, we might be saying something like, toys must be put away before bedtime, or we speak with kind words, no yelling or name calling. For older kids and teens, we might be talking about if you borrow something, return it in the same condition. If you make a mess, you clean it up. Respect means listening when someone is talking. And if you break a rule, you have to take responsibility for your actions. Whether we're talking about young kids or older kids and teens, what you're really doing with the behavioral boundaries is you're setting a foundation so that when kids are no longer living with you at home, which hopefully they will be at some point, um, what we're helping is to set the foundation of what the expectations are. If they don't respect behavioral boundaries or they're not as familiar, a lot of times what we see at our clinic is what we call emerging adults coming back and not understanding why in the world outside their family there's certain consequences. Well, I didn't know that if I was late by 20 minutes that I'd get fired from a job. I didn't know that, the professors were going to say that final draft is in at this time, and this is what happens if you don't get it in on time. So even though those are future things, what we're doing is we're setting the foundation now for what responsible behavior and what the expectations might be like in the future, and teaching them there are consequences for actions. So those are the four types of boundaries we're going to be talking about. But now we're going to move into how do you do that? Because it's easy to talk about. It's not as easy to kind of go, okay, well, what do we do in our family to create those boundaries? So When we're working with clients at the clinic, the first thing that we always talk about when we're looking at creating boundaries is, what are your values? It's important to understand what is important for your family, because those are going to be what helps you define what boundaries you want to have. So, for example, someone might say that in their family, it's important for everyone to eat together at the table and that there will be a consequence if you get up from the table. If that's important because you're going, okay, for us, family time is something that is important, that's great. You know, another family might go, okay, well, we have a really busy schedule and we have sports and we have activities and we have dance, and we might not have that as a value, which is okay because every family has different values and different priorities. And it's more important for us that they understand that, if you sign up and you're part of the team, you need to make it to practices, games, recitals, etc., and support your team or organization. Neither one is better than the other, but each family might have different expectations. Kind of going along with the sports, recitals, activities thing, someone else might say, hey, you know, if you join an activity and we have a family thing, family comes first. And we're going to say, if it's a practice or you have stage crew for play or something like that, that if we have a family thing, you're going to have to not be at stage crew that night and do the family thing with our family because that is important. Someone else might say, hey, you signed up for this, they're counting on you, you need to be there. Neither is right or wrong, but knowing what your values are is going to be that foundation, hopefully, with those examples that you can see that start to go, okay, where are we going to set our boundaries? The next thing is to communicate clearly. And the big thing with this is to use simple and age appropriate language. A lot of times, people might go into lengthy explanations as to why they're setting a boundary. Really, truly, when you do that, you get a lot of blank stares, a lot of kids that are tuning out. Maybe they're not paying attention. So then, when you put that boundary into action, they don't know what's going on. The easiest thing is to keep it simple and repetitive. And we'll talk about that in a second. But what that does is it creates a pathway in the brain where you can use that phrase to kind of cue something up later on. So keeping it simple is an excellent way to set a boundary. You also want to validate emotions without letting them override rules. Hey, I understand that you're frustrated with this, and I would be frustrated too. And also, this is a rule that we have, and we can't change what the outcome or the consequence is with this. There are exceptions, and we'll talk about that. Like, how do you make it flexible without getting rid of the rule altogether? Because when that happens, kids tend to go, well, you broke this rule over here, you were flexible over here, so why aren't you being flexible over there? There's a way to kind of work that out a little bit. But defining the rules ahead of time in simple and direct language, validating their feelings will help to communicate what the expectation is. The biggest thing is being consistent. Um, when we follow through with expectations and consequences, we let them know that this is going to be the same every time. If the rules are changing all the time, what you then create is an environment that is chaotic where kids can go, I don't know that I need to pay attention to this rule or not, because depending on the day or how tired you are or what else you've got going on, maybe the rule isn't going to apply. And then parents will end up more likely getting into power struggles with their kids over that. So be consistent when you set a rule, be realistic when you set a rule. That's something that comes up a lot when we're talking about this in the clinic. When you're making a rule, you have to ask yourself, is this actually something I'm going to be able to follow through with? Because if you're not, then it's probably better to either look at adapting it or not doing it at all, because you need to be able to be consistent, and always applying the agreed upon consequence. And the last piece is model the behavior. You want to show kids that you adhere to your own boundaries so that when you ask them to do that as well, they're seeing, okay, everyone in the family is doing this. And a great example is this. And I am the worst at this as well. But if we go back to the screen time example and we say, okay, screens must be turned off an hour before bedtime. And we're doing that because we want our brains to kind of start to settle down before sleep, and we don't want our sleep to be interrupted. This isn't as big a deal with younger kids who might go to bed earlier than their parents, but when you get to the middle school, teenage years, they might get closer to where your bedtime is. And if you, like me, at times are on your phone, and they go, well, you said no screens before bedtime, but you're on screens before bedtime. It's a fair point. So you want to make sure that you're modeling the explanation as to why you're doing that as well. And if there's an expectation that there might be something else going on, you can say that. Okay, you're right. The deal is that we turn off screens before bed. But if your grandmother calls, or I'm getting a text from a family member and someone's in the hospital, I'm going to be looking at my phone. But I'm not going to be playing games on my phone before bedtime. So making sure that you're modeling the behavior you want to see with your kids, also very important. So when we talk about age appropriate boundaries, this changes over time. When we're talking about preschoolers or young children, we're talking about very simple rules, something that is repetitive, and something that you can use positive reinforcement with. So the phrase that was brought up earlier in the presentation, hands are for helping, not for hitting. Saying it the same way each time creates a cue. The brain actually strings together different synapses, so then it becomes more of an automatic thought. When I say no hurts, this is what's going to happen. And when we keep it simple and repetitive, again, kids will key into it quicker. When we're moving to school aged kids, what we're talking about is more clear explanations as to the why, but you want to be careful that those explanations don't turn into lectures, because that's when we get kids that don't pay attention as much. And we're starting to incorporate more natural consequences. Natural consequences are a lot more effective than if you are doing something like grounding someone, or using our example, taking away screens. If there's not a connection, the kids don't always understand like why that boundary is what it is. So there are going to be times where you can't have a natural consequence when you're trying to manufacture for school age kids, like respect. There isn't always a clear consequence for respect. There is when you're talking about friends and teachers and whatnot, but there might not be at home. So then you might have something where you're talking about, okay, well, this is what's going to happen if we're disrespectful. But where we can put in natural consequences, we want to do that. So an example might be for a teenager, if you stay out later than your curfew, or you get home later than your curfew, maybe the amount of time that you're over your curfew is going to be taken off the next time that you go out. And if you get a kid who's like, hey, well, I'm supposed to be able to stay out until such and such time. And you're like, yeah, I wish you could, but you came back half an hour late last week. And so, that means you're going to have to come back half an hour early this week. Or maybe you're going to lose the privilege of being able to go out the next weekend. And so, with age appropriate ideas, what we're really trying to do is help them to understand there are consequences for your choices that you make. When we move into more middle school and high school, what we're talking about is collaborative boundary setting and allowing them a little bit more independence and autonomy. And what that means is when you're talking about middle schoolers and teenagers, you're the parents, you're the ones in charge. But involving them in the process of creating those expectations and what the consequences are increases their buy-in into why those things need to happen. So let's take, for example, screen time again. If we are doing that with teenagers, we might be sitting around and going, okay, we're having a problem with getting our homework done, or we're having a problem with, spending too much time on video games. Let's talk about the reasons why that might be problematic. Involve them in that conversation. And then when it gets to the consequences, you might already have in your mind an idea of what you want the consequence to be, but you want to open it up to the teenagers to be involved and collaborative as well. Like, hey, if the deal is you don't get your homework done and you're going to have issues at school, what do you think the consequence should be at home if we find that you're spending too much time on screens? they're more likely, one, to follow through if they were involved with setting that goal instead of going, well, the goal that you set was unattainable, or that's not going to happen, or it's not fair. And also, should you run into issues with boundaries with them later, it's a nice reminder about their own responsibility to kind of say, hey, remember how you sat down and you talked with us and you agreed that this would be the appropriate consequence? This isn't us being mean parents. You were involved with this as well. So it helps to kind of avoid that struggle between parents and children and getting into power struggles with them by reminding them that these were some of the choices that they made. And if they don't like the consequence when it's happening, that's really hard and you can feel bad for them. And also, they were involved in setting that, with you. And that can be really helpful for them to understand consequences and what that looks like. So, what can you do to emphasize some of these boundaries at home? First of all, helping kids with resources so that if they are upset with a boundary or if there's a consequence that's happening because a boundary was breached, that can be helpful. Here's what we do when we're upset. We do some deep breathing or journaling, or we're going to talk it out, or there's a quiet corner that you can go to. So making sure that they have ways to cope with some of those feelings that might come up if they're angry or frustrated or sad because of a boundary. I wish I could go to this thing with my friends, but we have a dinner with grandparents we have to go to. Okay, well, what can you do? What can we do about this instead of acting out is helpful. With younger kids, again, using timers and visual schedules is really helpful. So if you haven't seen them, there's timer apps where it's like a circle, and as the red circle gets smaller, you see a picture. That can help kids who can't tell time to be able to visualize time and know how much time they have left to be able to get things done, like evening routines or getting ready before school. Visual schedules where you can kind of go through, like, here's this step, and then after, like, let's say first we brush our teeth, then we put on our pajamas, then we go read stories. That can help kids to understand time as well. With older kids, you want them to help you with creating their schedule because, again, we're getting that buy-in from older kids and adolescents. You want to use logical, natural consequences, which we talked about, so that it matches the behavior. You want to encourage positive behavior. So when you see them following those boundaries, maybe not at that moment, but at some point, randomly, you might want to say, hey, I've noticed that you've really been working hard to kind of follow this. And we just wanted to let you know we appreciate that. You want to allow the natural consequences to occur. Now, this is a big one because for a lot of parents, there are things that pull our heartstrings that we want to help our kids out. And you may have seen our presentation last fall on supportive parenting of anxious childhood emotions, but we did a lot of talking about accommodations and the research around accommodations and how they actually encourage some of the behaviors that we don't want to see to continue to happen. So, an example would be, if you left, let's say you've got an older child and they leave their phone at home and they're like, you need to get me that phone. If it is safe and appropriate, they don't need that phone. They're coming home on the bus after school. For a lot of parents, they're like, their first instinct is, I'm going to run that over to you and drop it off with the school. But when we do that, what ends up happening is we're creating an accommodation. And that allows kids to go, okay, my parent's going to jump in and fix this if there's a problem. And also, I don't have to sit with negative feelings that happen when, I don't have what I want or need. Again, clarifying when it's safe and appropriate. The example on this slide is, if you forget your lunch, you'll feel hungry until you get home. Obviously, if a kid's staying for activities after school and they're not going to be getting home until 6 or 7, you don't want them to not eat lunch. But if they're at one of the schools in District 73 that gets out on Wednesdays at like 2:30 in the afternoon, and you know that they're going to get home, you might be like, okay, well, see if there's a hot lunch that you can grab there, or, if your friends can give you something to kind of tide you over. And when you get home, we'll make sure that you have a big lunch. That one helps kids to understand, okay, I need to be responsible for getting my lunch in my bag. And two, it also helps them to kind of understand, yes, you can do this. Negative things might happen. You're going to be able to get through it. And we're going to help you to be able to do that. So, if you want to learn a little bit more about natural consequences and how that affects kids' codependence on their parents, and the accommodations that we might make, I might suggest looking at our presentation on parenting anxious children, because we go into that in depth. But it is a good reminder on why we need to have some consequences, because if we're constantly saving our children from certain things, they don't learn the coping skills to be able to help themselves and become more responsible. So that's great and all, but sometimes you're going to get pushback. And the example, I didn't have a rubber band today, so we're going to use this thing here. Um, the example that I like to use is that there's research on family systems, and family systems like to stay stable, even if it's dysfunctional behaviors. So if we take something like this or like a rubber band, if I stretch it, it's going to snap back to its original form. Families are very much like this, whether you're dealing with children or your extended family members. They like to be in roles where they feel comfortable. Again, even if it is dysfunctional. So, whenever you are changing a boundary or you're instituting a boundary, think of it like a rubber band and you're trying to stretch it out of its shape. That means that they are going to test the limits of your boundary. They are going to see, are there loopholes? Is there anything we can do? Because they want it to go back to this same shape. But if you've ever stretched out a rubber band, you might remember that when you stretch something out and you keep it stretched long enough, it's eventually going to take on the shape that you've stretched it out to. And so, what this means is that this kind of goes back to that idea of consistency. If boundaries are being pushed, and we're being permissive and we're not being consistent with consequences, we're going to snap back to that original shape. But if we're being consistent about sticking with those boundaries, eventually the shape will change. So kids are not inherently malicious, but kids also will test boundaries. So keep in mind that you have to kind of expect that there's going to be pushback. When I'm working with families at our clinic, typically I'll say, if we're putting in a boundary, you might get pushback for 2 to 4 weeks. And you got to stick with it, because after you've done it for 2 to 4 weeks, they start to kind of get the idea that, yes, this is going to be the new way of handling things. Also, when you're doing this, don't like institute a lot of boundaries at one time, because that's going to feel very overwhelming. You might start with one. And again, once you get past that hump of like 2 to 4 weeks, maybe you're going to put in another one. Now, the older that your kid is, the more boundaries you can kind of introduce at the same time. The younger your kid is, you might want to only do it one at a time. You might also get a challenge where a kid's going to try and negotiate with you or argue with you. You know, we've heard the phrase, maybe in my house, like that kid's going to be a lawyer when they grow up. And that's great. But you want to use a firm and empathetic response. I understand you're upset, but the rule still stands. This is teaching kids the foundation of not only, hey, these are the rules of our house, and as a family member, you need to be accountable to these rules as well, but it will help them again when they get older, when they start working, when they go into the world with other people or get into relationships, if they do, that there are certain boundaries that cannot be crossed. Um, Again, sometimes as parents, we feel guilty over setting rules. And kind of like we were just talking about accommodations and how those can have negative consequences when we're constantly stepping in to try and save kids from feeling, bad about certain things, as long as it doesn't have to do with safety. Remind yourself that boundaries are a necessary thing for emotional security and development. And again, you're going to hear this again and again. Being consistent or inconsistent is a challenge in terms of boundaries. So you want to make sure that the rules are simple and that they're things that you can actually follow. Are they doable? Are they realistic? Is it something we're going to be able to enforce? So we kind of talked a little bit about this with the pushback, but we're going to kind of go into a little bit more some of the pitfalls to avoid, and that has to do with being inconsistent. That leads to weak boundaries, permissive boundaries, and we've kind of talked about what does that look like with parents and children. But again, if we're looking forward as kids get to be young adults, it also sets the foundation when they're with friends or they're in relationships with others. If you have weak boundaries, you're going to be more likely to do things that maybe you know aren't right or not okay, but you're going to go, well, but I don't want to, you know, not do this and not be involved or get cut out of the group. And so clear boundaries help kids to understand as they get older that when they set their own boundaries, that those are boundaries to be followed. So I'm not okay with this. Okay, your parents aren't home, we're going to have a party. You know what? I'm out. I don't feel comfortable. I know that there are consequences when these kinds of things happen. And I feel very comfortable with leaving because I know what will most likely happen in this situation. The guilt-driven parenting leads to poor boundary enforcement, which we've talked about. And the one thing that we haven't talked about so far is over control. So there's a fine balance between having boundaries and having too many boundaries. So you also want to be careful that there's not so many boundaries that it stifles independence and responsibility. We want kids to make mistakes. Part of why we have these boundaries when kids are young and when they're teenagers is because they're with people who love them, that will help them figure it out, that will help them deal with the feelings around that. But if you don't give them the space to try things out and maybe have a consequence that happens, then they're not getting that experience to know what that's going to be like as an emerging adult or in adult relationships where they're going to get real pushback from people at work or potential partners that they might be with or activities that they might do. So we want to give them a little bit of rope to go out and try stuff and remember that if they aren't following through with a boundary that is set and there's a consequence, that's okay because this is a safe place for them to kind of do some of this stuff now before they go places where it's not going to be their parents that are setting the rules or boundaries. So, some final tips for success. As I've mentioned lots of times, consistency is key. Boundaries are more effective when enforced consistently. You want to be patient. Change takes time. As we were just talking about, this is the time for them to test those limits and find out what happens because they are safe within your family system rather than having them go out in the world and learning how to test those things and having some real world consequences. If it's hard, which often it is, seek support. You can connect with other parents or professionals when needed. We have support groups for parents. That is a great opportunity for parents to kind of bring some of their concerns and get some support from other parents or professionals. You can seek out parent coaching and therapy, whether it's at our clinic, there's other clinics at the area that have programs on how to do that because it can be really hard to set some of these boundaries and make them effective when working with your kids. So, with that, I also want to leave you with some resources. And, I know it's up on the screen right now. We can also make sure that it can be sent out to everyone. There's some really great books on how the brain works with both children and teenagers, and that can help you understand how they think and how that relates to boundaries. There's some really great episodes of podcasts, and we listed a couple here. And also, there's other resources in the community. I've mentioned our own clinic and parent coaching, but there's also the referral GPS that all the schools participate in, where you can go on and if you have specific issues, it can tell you who's in your area. The Child Mind Institute has some really great videos and articles on boundaries and how they help with developing empathy. There are other resources that are out there, but hopefully this gets you started. And as always, as mentioned before, you can always check us out at touchstonetherapycenter.com to view all of our services. We do provide support groups, social skills groups. We have workshops. We have different programs. We run the supportive parenting of anxious childhood emotions program that is through the Yale Child Study Center. and is research based, evidence based in terms of helping kids with anxiety, safe and sound protocol, which has to do with how to help kids to calm themselves down through listening programs, and more. So if you want to go check us out, you can go to the QR code there. And I want to thank everyone for attending today. I know that there's a lot of information in a short amount of time, but hopefully this will get you started and we can move into the Q&A portion of this presentation. So thank you again.